All right, everybody. So this screencast is going to be about energy, and particularly, it's going to be about comparing and contrasting cellular respiration and photosynthesis. But I want to kind of frame this thing with this AP question. So you get this little model here of carbon cycle, and it says identify the key metabolic processes for step one and step two. So when we talk about metabolic processes, we're talking about chemical reactions, and a lot of times, um, metabolism can be broken down into either anabolic, which is building up, or catabolic, which is breaking down. And what they're referring to here is that you talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis and the particular stages of those that are involved. It also says briefly explain how each process promotes the movement of carbon through the cycle, and then focus on the role of energy in the movement of carbon. So, again, we're getting, when you hear energy, you're thinking ATP. And then the second part here is to identify an organism that does both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So, keeping that in the back of your mind, let's get into this. So, life has the ability to independently use energy to offset the random breakdown of nature, maintain homeostasis, and respond to stimuli. Now, that's kind of a complicated definition, but life would not exist without energy. And if organisms can't use energy and independently use it, they will die. For example, if you think about humans, we have this huge complex brain, right? And in order to make the nervous system work, we've learned about the sodium potassium pump resetting ion concentrations. And being a pump, it requires ATP to move those ions back and forth. And without that, our brain wouldn't work. And if our brain doesn't work, we die. We also have this cheetah here. And a lot of times when we think about energy, we can tie it back into physics. So in physics, if we're talking about energy, we're talking about the ability to do work. And when we're talking about work, we're talking about force times distance. Now, in physics, a lot of times you're thinking about pushing carts or different things like that, things getting pulled and pushed in different directions with forces. But a lot of times it's at a large mechanical scale. Now, our scales within living things are much smaller because we're talking about things at a cellular level. And yes, a cheetah is going to apply great force and move great distances, but within there, what's doing the work is actually at the cellular level where microscopic forces are moving microscopic distances. So whether it's the heart or whether it's the muscle cells, we have this sliding filament theory of muscle contraction, where these actin and myosin filaments within myofibrils or muscle cells are kind of rowing on each other to shorten cells. And that contraction or that rowing requires the use of ATP. So we're thinking about that at a cellular level, microscopic forces and microscopic distances. Whenever we're talking about growth and development of organisms, a lot of times it's not just getting bigger, but mitotically dividing cells. So we can go from one cell to trillions of cells in months, and in that process, every time you go through mitosis, um, chromosomes and organelles need to be moved. And all of that microscopic movement is force times distance. We also have not just movement on this big scale with this cheetah, but we can think about amoeba and moving through, pond water and the little cilia or little hairs on the outside, propelling that little protista around in the water. And all of that force times distance is work. And if you're going to do work, you need energy, and we pay for that energy within living things with ATP. So this slideshow is really going to be a constant flipping back and forth between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the organisms that do both. So when we think of photosynthesis, typically we think of plants. But if we're thinking about green leafy plants, that's a small portion of what's actually, still a fairly large portion, but over half of all photosynthesis actually takes place in the water. So we have these huge complex food chains and food webs in the water, and that begins with phytoplankton. So all of these tiny little things, cyanobacteria within water, are able to do cellular respiration, but we also have algae in water that can do cellular respiration. And it's not all green leafy plants either. We have conifers that are also doing photosynthesis as well. So as we move on here, we have organisms that do so. What things do cellular respiration? A lot of times when we think of respiration, we're thinking about large scale mechanical breathing like CPR kind of stuff. But when we're talking cellular respiration, we're really talking about the breakdown of organic molecules. So the energy stored in the bonds of fatty acids or glucose and sugars or complex carbohydrates or even amino acids. Um, that energy that's stored in those molecules needs to be released and then changed into a usable form of chemical energy in ATP, turning gold into cash. So everything has to break down organic molecules, whether it's animals. I know a lot of times we think about like animals do cellular respiration. Well, so do plants and fungus and protista, the catch-all group, and bacteria and the different kinds of bacteria. They all have to break down organic molecules. So they all have to do cellular respiration in some form. Now, a lot of times we also focus on the organelles. And when we start talking about the individual chemicals involved in photosynthesis, we're going to be talking about where they occur and the stages of photosynthesis. And in order to do that, we got to be familiar with the chloroplasts. Now, not everything that does photosynthesis uses chloroplasts, but we're going to focus on the thylakoid membrane because we still need to generate ATP and capture the energy from sunlight with chlorophyll. And that's all going to be happening with these membranes in the thylakoid. And then when carbon dioxide is built up into sugars, that happens out here in the stroma of the chloroplast. When we're talking mitochondria, again, we have this bean-shaped looking thing. And again, with the generation of ATP, we need a membrane because it's the pumping of hydrogen ions across membranes and diffusing back through ATP synthase where we generate all that ATP. So we've got to have this membrane. Now, the other thing with this that's important to keep in mind is that we have a matrix here. The matrix is the very center, and that's where when we talk about Krebs cycle happening in the mitochondrial matrix, this is the region we're talking about. Okay, so jumping back to photosynthesis again, we see a plant cell right here with a cell wall, and within there that has different organelles, including a nucleus and a big water vacuole and endoplasmic reticulum. We also have these chloroplasts. When we look at a chloroplast, we break down photosynthesis into two major processes. The light reactions, which are bringing in light and energizing electrons within the membrane of the thylakoid, and water breaking down is supplying those electrons to the chlorophyll. As water breaks down, oxygen is given off. So the main purpose here of the light reactions is to generate ATP and NADPH. These high energy compounds can go into the Calvin cycle where carbon dioxide is built up into sugar. So ultimately, we take this energy from light, store it transfer it into chemical energy here, and then transfer it into chemical energy here with the sugar. So all of that chemical energy that's built up into organic compounds can be broken back down into ATP to be used for all that work that we were just talking about. So cellular respiration has three major steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. This is our mitochondria. And out here, our first stage, we first take that glucose and break it down into pyruvate. That provides a few electrons being carried by NADs to the electron transport chain. And that generates some ATP. So, there are moments where we need energy quick and fast, and we do anaerobic processes to generate small amounts of ATP. But to get the most bang for our buck, we have to get over here to this amount of ATP. So we take this split sugar, the pyruvate, transfer it into acetyl-CoA, and it jumps into the Krebs cycle. In the Krebs cycle, we do produce a little bit of ATP, but generally we make a tremendous amount of electrons to be carried through the NADs and FADs to the electron transport chain. In the electron transport chain, through the electrons powering the pumps and hydrogen ions getting pumped across to high concentration, diffusing back through ATP synthase, this is where we generate the vast majority of our ATP. So we have three main stages: glycolysis, that's happening outside of the mitochondria, and then the Krebs cycle in the matrix, and the electron transport chain with the proteins embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so the chemical formula. Now we're really going to focus on the chemicals involved and how they get involved. So in photosynthesis, we plants take in, or photosynthetic organisms like plants take in carbon dioxide and water. They harvest energy from the sun, and that builds up organic matter like glucose, and they also give off oxygen. So these are the reactants, and these are the products. These come in, these are produced. Cellular respiration is the exact reverse of that. So if photosynthesis is building up glucose, cellular respiration is ultimately breaking it down. So the energy stored in the bonds of this organic material ends up becoming energy stored in ATP, which can actually be used. So oxygen is also a reactant along with glucose, and the products are carbon dioxide and water, and we also get a whole bunch of ATP out of that. So now let's look at individual things. Water and oxygen is involved with photosynthesis and with cellular respiration. In photosynthesis, water and oxygen are involved in the thylakoid membrane. And here we have chlorophyll, and the light energy from the sun gets absorbed by the chlorophyll, and the chlorophyll ends up energizing electrons. But where do those electrons come from? The electrons come from water. Water, as it's split, provides electrons to the chlorophyll, which get energized by the sunlight, which end up powering pumps. Now, as water is split, oxygen is produced, and also we produce hydrogen ions or protons. In cellular respiration, we also have oxygen and water involved, but it's at the very end of the electron transport chain where oxygen comes in and cleans up and makes water. So all of these electrons being passed along the electron transport chain, they have to be removed from the electron transport chain by oxygen. If for any reason we are in oxygen debt, or if there's a particular chemical that is blocking the ability of oxygen to remove the electrons, this whole process stops because it creates a logjam of electrons here. The NADs and FADs can no longer drop off more electrons because the electrons are stuck here, which prevents all of this to be pumped across and diffusing back. If it doesn't diffuse back, we don't get ATP. If we don't get ATP, we die. So ultimately, oxygen is incredibly important here because it removes the electrons and it produces water. In photosynthesis, we also have carbon dioxide and glucose involved. In photosynthesis, we are focusing on the Calvin cycle. So if this is our chloroplast, we have our light reactions, which are generating ATP. But in our Calvin cycle, it's when carbon dioxide comes in and glucose comes out. Now, again, we talk about this G3P here. Ultimately, when we talk about the chemical formula, we're really focused on glucose, C6H12O6. However, this process can make all the other organic compounds like lipids and all the carbon basic structure for other things like amino acids and everything like that. So all of that ATP and NADPH stored energy from the light reactions get involved and invested in here as well. So ATP is and NADPH is providing energy into this so that as carbon dioxide is built up, it's gaining and storing energy in the bonds of this glucose. So again, photosynthesis, carbon dioxide goes in, glucose comes out, and that's involved in the Calvin cycle. In cellular respiration, again, instead of ending with glucose, like in photosynthesis, cellular respiration begins with glucose because cellular respiration is about breaking down and releasing the energy stored in the bonds of glucose. So we begin with glucose in glycolysis. Glycolysis splits the sugar, provides some electrons, provides some ATP, and then we go into the mitochondria. That pyruvate becomes acetyl-CoA, which jumps into the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, produces lots of electrons and NADs and FADs for electron transport chain. But ultimately, we are done with the carbon molecule at the Krebs cycle because that's where the CO2 comes out. So it's at this Krebs cycle that we make a little bit of ATP again, but it's where we generate the vast majority of our electrons and where the carbon molecule exits the system. So both photosynthesis and cellular respiration involve electron transport chains, which generate ATP. So in photosynthesis and the light-dependent reactions, again, we have chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is where the electrons are energized. The electrons come from water as it's split. The energy from the sun breaks adds energy to the electrons. The electrons power the pumps, which move hydrogen ions to high concentration up here, along with these hydrogen ions that are coming from the split of water. These hydrogen ions diffuse back through this channel enzyme ATP synthase, which then ultimately generates ATP. This ATP can go to the Calvin cycle and help carbon dioxide build up and make sugar. But in the second chlorophyll, we also re-energize these electrons, which power the pumps, to have those electrons get picked up and make NADPH. This NADPH also provides energy, along with ATP, in the generation of glucose in the Calvin cycle. Again, we see a membrane here, and now instead of being in the thylakoid membrane within cellular respiration, we're looking at the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Again, we're talking about generating ATP, but instead of having light energize the electrons that are coming from the breakdown of glucose are already highly energized. So as we break down glucose in glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, NADs and FADs are carrying these high energy electrons to the electron transport chain. The electrons power the pumps, hydrogen ions get pumped to high concentration, they diffuse back through ATP synthase, and it's at the ATP synthase, it's an ACE, it's an enzyme, that ends up making the vast majority of the ATP. And again here, the electrons get cleaned up by the water, which picks up a couple of hydrogen ions, or by the oxygen, which ends up making water. So all of this jumping back and forth with cellular respiration and photosynthesis, these processes are interdependent. Photosynthesis, the products of photosynthesis are oxygen and glucose. These things are making oxygen and glucose, which then be used by cellular respiration to make carbon dioxide and water, which then is used in photosynthesis. So the products of one are the reactants of the other, and the products of one are the reactants of the other. Now, in this cycle, it's showing separate organisms doing these two processes. Now, this could just as easily be happening within a plant, because while the green leaves are doing photosynthesis, the roots, which continue to grow, are going to be doing cellular respiration because there's no photosynthesis taking place in the roots. So we need to be able to take these stored glucose and be used by every other living cell within that plant to do cellular respiration and take the energy from the food that's made by the leaves. Now, when we see this as a cycle, because when we're talking about matter and the chemistry involved, this matter is not created or destroyed, it only changes form, and it continues to be cycled. So everything that's on the planet chemically has always existed on the planet, it's just been changing forms. However, when we talk about energy, again, energy is not created or destroyed, it only changes form. So we have the sun, through nuclear fusion, taking hydrogen and smashing it together and building up into helium. That energy that's coming from the sun is getting absorbed by plants, and that energy, although these units of energy seem to be decreasing, when we are talking about this, energy is not lost as it travels up this energy pyramid. It's simply changing forms and being released as heat at each level. So we've got plants that are flowing, taking the energy from the sun, and that energy flows through the system. We don't cycle the energy. It's not like the snake sends the energy back to the sun. it's flowing through the system. So when we start transitioning from this energy to ecology, this is going to be a huge theme. We'll look at populations and how populations change, but when we start talking about ecosystems and organisms in the environment, we're really talking about how matter cycles, whether it's carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water. But we're talking about how matter is going to cycle between the environment and organisms. And we're going to talk about how energy flows through food chains, food webs, energy pyramids between organisms. So, again, all of this, in order for these life forms to exist, when we start talking about ecology, we've got to have something that can trap the energy from the sun and turn it into organic compounds so that those stored energy can be transferred up food chains and up food chains and up food chains and continue living things. So let's come back to this where we started. The key metabolic process for step one and step two. So let's think for a second. When carbon dioxide is built up into glucose, what is step one? When glucose is broken down and carbon dioxide is released, what is process two? Now, with those processes, can we get even more specific about at what stage is carbon dioxide built up? So obviously, this one here is going to be photosynthesis, right? But can you answer at which stage of photosynthesis we take in carbon dioxide and get out glucose? And in which stages of cellular respiration, because this is cellular respiration, breaking down glucose to produce carbon dioxide, at which stages here do we break down the sugar and ultimately kick out the carbon dioxide? And how is ATP and how is energy involved in all of that? Now, we talked about organisms that do both. We obviously do cellular respiration, but we don't do photosynthesis. So we are not an organism that does both, and this is an organism, one organism that does both. So you got to think about something that does photosynthesis, but also does cellular respiration. We know that anything that does photosynthesis also does cellular respiration because every living thing has to do cellular respiration. So when we started looking at this from an AP standpoint, in step one was photosynthesis, and in particular, the Calvin cycle is where carbon dioxide is built up into organic compounds. And in cellular respiration and the Krebs cycle and glycolysis, it begins the breakdown. The Krebs cycle is where we end up producing the carbon dioxide. Now, when we start talking about photosynthesis, carbon is brought in, carbon is a product as organic molecules, and we use light energy, ATP. And where does that ATP come from to build up these organic molecules? It comes from the light reactions. In cellular respiration, as we break down organic molecules, we produce CO2, but how is ATP involved? A lot of this is happening, especially within the electron transport chain. Now, again, you can see with organisms that carry out both processes, these are all photosynthetic. And that is going to be a wrap here. Hopefully, your mind's not too much blown, but again, the big idea, you don't have to memorize every single step of the Calvin cycle or the Krebs cycle. You have to be familiar with the models, and you have to be able to compare and contrast cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and you have to be able to make connections to other big ideas like ecology and evolution. So I hope that was helpful.